14. May 1943, near Enfidaville, Tunisia. Gefreiter Karl Weber lay flat in the shallow scrape he had clawed into the dry earth, the air thick with dust and the sour smell of burnt fuel. The roar of artillery had quieted into scattered bursts. Above him, the sky was empty of the Stukas and Messerschmitts that German radio had promised would never abandon the Afrika Korps. Instead, he saw only distant specks of Allied aircraft circling like patient birds. Karl's unit from the 90th Light Division had been falling back for days, short of fuel, short of ammunition, always short of food. He was 27 years old, a trained commercial artist from Hamburg, who had once painted theater posters and sketched caricatures for a small satirical magazine that the new regime had shut down. In the desert, he had become a gunner, then a survivor, worn down by sand, hunger, and orders that no longer made sense. When the British armored cars appeared on the ridge and the last German officers walked forward waving white cloths, Karl felt something inside him break loose, a mix of shame and relief so strong it made his hands tremble. He did not think of Hitler. He thought of bread. He thought of his sketchbook, folded under his tunic, filled with small, forbidden drawings of officers, slogans, and a leader whose face he had learned to copy with mocking precision. A quiet treason that, if discovered, would have cost him everything long before British patrols reached his line. Now, as he watched his comrades stand up and raise their hands, he understood that the war, as he had been told it would be, was already over. The surrender that swept Karl into captivity was part of one of the largest mass capitulations in modern history. Between 12 and 13 May 1943, the remnants of the German and Italian armies in North Africa laid down their arms in Tunisia. Estimates placed the total number of prisoners captured by the Allies in the Tunisian pocket between 238,000 and 275,000, including veterans of the Afrika Korps who had once driven British forces back to Egypt. Entire divisions ceased to exist in a matter of days. The collapse was not simply a battlefield defeat. It was the result of strangled supply lines, Allied control of the Mediterranean, and an industrial balance that had turned decisively against the Axis. While Karl and men like him were scraping the bottom of fuel drums, American factories were already turning out Liberty ships at a rate that astonished even their own planners, and British convoys were arriving with growing reliability. The German High Command had promised Africa would be held. Instead, the Allied net closed with mathematical certainty. In the dust and confusion of that May, thousands of prisoners like Karl were marched to improvised cages near the front, part of a human tide that would soon be carried across seas and continents into a network of prison camps that stretched from North Africa to the interior of the United States. For most, captivity meant uncertainty, boredom, and the slow erosion of belief. For Karl Weber, it would become the setting for a transformation driven by a talent that his own government had tried to silence. Under a white sun at a barbed wire enclosure near Enfidaville, Karl stood in line as British and American officers moved along the rows of prisoners, checking tags, asking questions, trying to sort units and ranks. The ground was hard, the dust fine as flour, his tongue coated with thirst. Around him, rumors moved faster than orders. Some men said they would be shot. Others insisted they would be exchanged. A sergeant from his battery claimed that officers would be separated and transported to Canada, while the enlisted men would be used as labor in the desert. Karl kept silent, his hands clasped behind his head, feeling the stiff crackle of paper under his tunic. The sketchbook he had smuggled through months of retreat felt suddenly heavy. In Hamburg, before the war, He had made his living in a small studio off the Steindam, painting bright posters for theaters and cafes, drawing quick portraits for couples on Sunday afternoons, selling sly cartoons to a satirical paper that printed jokes about pompous officials and empty slogans. After 1933, the paper disappeared. New regulations reached his trade. He was told what to paint and what not to paint. Jazz musicians vanished from his posters. Certain faces were never to be mocked. When conscription took him in 1940, he packed the habit of drawing along with his shaving kit, a quiet resistance confined to small pages and quick lines. In the cage, as evening came and the Allies issued their first rations of tea, bread, and tinned meat, he hesitated, then slipped the notebook out and began to sketch the scene around him. Worn faces, patched uniforms, British guards with slouch hats, an American military policeman leaning on a jeep. The pencil moved almost on its own. A passing American lieutenant paused, watching. He said something to the interpreter, who turned to Karl. The officer wanted to see. Karl hesitated, then handed over the book. The lieutenant leafed through page after page of precise studies, caricatures of officers, of Goebbels, of the Führer himself with tired eyes and sagging cheeks. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the American's mouth twitched. He closed the book, tapped the cover with one finger, and said quietly in careful German that this kind of drawing had been dangerous service at home. It might be useful now. What happened to Karl next took place within a vast machinery that processed human beings in numbers that seemed to him impossible. Within weeks, thousands of prisoners from North Africa were moved through ports like Oran and Algiers, then loaded onto British and American ships for the journey across the Atlantic. By summer 1943, Liberty ships were carrying as many as 3,000 prisoners a month to the United States, as they returned from delivering war cargo to North Africa and Britain. Each Liberty ship was a floating proof of American industrial capacity, built from some 25,000 parts produced in dozens of factories, assembled in shipyards where construction times shrank from months to mere weeks. Karl's transport left Oran in late June, sailing in a convoy guarded by destroyers and aircraft. Below decks in a crowded hold, he felt the steady vibration of engines, heard the clatter of metal and the murmur of hundreds of voices. Food came in quantities he had not seen in years. White bread, coffee, meat more than once a day. The guards were firm, but not cruel. At night he shared a corner near a bulkhead with men from different units. By the light of a single bulb he drew again, on scraps of cardboard and the backs of lists, capturing the massive ribs of the ship, the faces of men listening to rumors, the surprising sight of American sailors laughing with one another in a way that did not fit the image of decadent weakness he had been taught. When they reached the American coast after nearly 2 weeks at sea, and he climbed the gangway into glaring daylight, he saw docks that stretched to the horizon, cranes swinging, warehouses stacked high, rail lines threaded with cars. Norfolk or Newport News, the name did not matter. What mattered was scale. In a single sweep of his eyes, he saw more cargo ships than he had ever imagined existed at all. In that moment, the propaganda of scarcity and encirclement, the speeches that had filled the wireless since 1939, began to sound hollow. He did not yet know that his drawings from the desert cage had been noted in an Allied intelligence report. He did not know that somewhere in the growing system of American prisoner administration, a small mark had been made beside his name. Artist. Fluent hand. Anti-Nazi tendencies suggested. He knew only that the world he had been taught to despise was larger, brighter, and stronger than anyone at home had dared to admit. The train that carried Karl Weber westward from Norfolk, Virginia, in August 1943, clattered through a landscape that looked unreal to him. He had expected ruined towns or wartime austerity. Instead, he saw bright storefronts, neon signs, full rail yards, and cars glinting under streetlights. Every small town seemed alive with power. From his seat in a Pullman car with padded benches and polished brass fittings, he watched as the landscape changed from coastal forests to fields of tobacco and cotton. The guards, mostly young American soldiers, joked quietly among themselves. They treated the prisoners with a mixture of caution and ordinary civility. When the train stopped at a junction near Roanoke, locals stood on the platform to watch, children waving despite orders from the guards to keep back. Karl felt a strange sense of embarrassment. The people outside did not look afraid. They looked curious. In Germany, the appearance of captured enemies had been used to inflame hatred. Here, ordinary citizens watched a train of enemy soldiers as if it were a passing spectacle in a peaceful land. He remembered what a British interpreter in Tunisia had said. The prisoners would be taken to America to work, to learn, to wait out the war. He had thought it was a joke. Now the miles unrolled, and the cities grew smaller, the land flatter, until they reached the vast plains of Texas, where the heat shimmered above the rails and the horizon seemed endless. The train finally slowed near a small station marked Hearn. Rows of wooden barracks stood beyond the tracks, surrounded by high fences and bright electric lights. Camp Hearn, Texas, would be his world for the next 3 years. The camp was one of more than 500 prisoner-of-war camps that the United States operated during the conflict. Built in 90 days on what had once been farmland, Camp Hearn housed up to 5,000 German soldiers at its peak. Across the country, approximately 371,000 German prisoners were held in such camps by 1945. The prisoners were governed by the Geneva Convention, which required fair treatment, adequate food, and medical care equivalent to that provided to the captor's own troops. For men who had lived on sparse desert rations and under constant threat, the difference was astonishing. Each barrack at Hearn had electric lights, showers with hot water, and heating systems for the winter. The camp included a hospital, a theater, a library, and workshops. American efficiency extended even to imprisonment. Prisoners rose to bugle calls, stood roll, and ate from metal trays in long, orderly lines. Breakfast might include eggs, milk, and fruit. Lunch and supper offered meat and vegetables in portions that seemed excessive after Africa. The irony was not lost on them. The enemies of democracy were eating better as captives than many civilians at home. Karl quickly found himself assigned to light labor in the camp maintenance crew, painting signs and repairing fences. When his artistic skill became known, the American officers encouraged him to decorate the recreation hall with murals of landscapes and scenes from home. At first he painted neutral subjects, mountains and rivers, but soon his old humor returned. He painted a large scene of German soldiers fishing beside an American lake, while guards looked on, smiling. The image became a minor sensation within the camp. Even the commandant stopped to look and said it showed good morale. What none of them knew was that the act of painting itself, the freedom to create without fear, was quietly undoing the layers of obedience that war had built inside him. By late 1943, American authorities began using selected prisoners in labor programs to ease wartime shortages in agriculture and construction. Texas alone employed more than 30,000 prisoners on farms, road crews, and canning plants. Karl volunteered for outside work, partly to escape boredom, partly to see more of the strange land beyond the wire. In September, he joined a group sent to pick cotton on a farm near College Station. The first morning, as they climbed from the trucks, he saw machinery unlike anything he had known in Europe. The fields stretched to the horizon, white with cotton bolls, and the farmers' equipment glittered with chrome. Electric pumps drew water from deep wells. Tractors moved across the soil in lines, guided by boys scarcely older than 16. The farmer greeted the prisoners politely, even shaking hands. He offered cold water from a galvanized tank and explained the work in slow English, then left them under the watch of 2 guards who sat in the shade. The pay, credited to their accounts at the camp, amounted to 80 cents a day, the same as American civilian laborers after deductions. The work was hard but fair. At noon, the farmer's wife brought sandwiches and coffee for everyone, prisoners included. Karl noticed that she did not look at them with fear or hatred. To her, they were laborers helping with the harvest. That night, back in camp, he sketched the scene by lantern light. Wide fields, endless sky, a farmer and his wife beside a tractor, the prisoners bending to their work. The drawing captured something he could not express in words, a small proof that even in captivity, dignity could survive. The camp newspaper printed it with a caption in German that translated roughly as "work worth doing." In early 1944, American officials began a quiet re-education program aimed at breaking the hold of Nazi ideology among the prisoners. It was run by the Special Projects Division of the Provost Marshal General's Office and relied not on lectures or punishment, but on exposure. Prisoners were given access to American newspapers, radio programs, and films. They attended classes in English, history, and economics. Karl's artistic work drew attention from the camp education officer, a former art teacher from Chicago, who loaned him books on American painting and architecture. Through these, Karl encountered ideas he had never been allowed to read in Germany. The freedom of expression championed by artists like Grant Wood and Thomas Hart Benton. The notion that art could criticize authority and still serve the nation. He filled new sketchbooks with scenes of the camp and portraits of fellow prisoners, each page signed simply KW. His work began to circulate beyond Herne. An American Red Cross official visiting from Washington requested several drawings to illustrate an internal report on prisoner welfare. Later that year, 2 of Karl's sketches appeared in a Texas newspaper, accompanying a feature about life in the POW camps. The article mentioned a gifted German artist who captures the humanity of enemies-turned-workers. When a copy of the paper reached the camp, other prisoners cheered. Some teased him, calling him the free man. He laughed, but the phrase lingered in his mind. Unknown to him, the newspaper clipping reached Washington, where it was forwarded to the WW2 Office of War Information as an example of positive domestic propaganda. His forbidden talent, once dangerous under the Reich, had become a small instrument of American soft power. The spring of 1944 brought a shift in the rhythm of captivity. The Allied advance in Europe filled the American newspapers, and inside Camp Herne, the prisoners followed the headlines printed in translation on notice boards. Karl Weber's daily work changed from field labor to assisting in the camp's new education and arts program. The American officers, encouraged by Washington's policy of rehabilitation, supported cultural activities to maintain order and morale. The camp theater, once used for roll calls and lectures, became a stage for concerts and plays. Karl was asked to design scenery and posters. He painted vast backdrops on canvas sheets scrounged from supply stores, reproducing forests and villages remembered from Europe. For the first time since 1940, he felt the controlled silence of concentration return, the absorption of line, color, and perspective. The guards watched with mild amusement as the prisoners rehearsed. When the first performance took place, an adaptation of Goethe's Faust, American officials attended out of curiosity. What surprised them was the discipline and artistry of men who had been fighting against them less than a year before. Afterward, the camp commander called Karl to his office and asked if he would consider decorating the camp's new chapel, a simple wooden building erected by German carpenters. The request stunned him. In Germany, his satire had been a crime. Here, his skill was being used to humanize enemies. That summer, outside work expanded as the demand for farm labor reached its height. America's fields were feeding armies across 2 oceans. In 1944 alone, the U.S. Department of Agriculture reported more than 14 million man-days of labor performed by prisoners of war, a figure equal to tens of thousands of full-time workers. Karl joined a team assigned to a fruit cannery near Bryan, Texas. The plant operated around the clock, processing hundreds of tons of tomatoes and peaches each week. He sketched the production line, conveyor belts moving like rivers, women in kerchiefs sorting fruit with practiced speed, steam rising from vats, the rhythmic hiss of pressure seals. It was his first direct view of American industrial agriculture. What struck him was not just the machinery, but the demeanor of the workers. They complained about wages and shifts, yet spoke freely to the supervisors. The foremen, ordinary men without decorations or ranks, listened to suggestions from the floor. The sense of hierarchy was looser, the tone less fearful. To Karl, raised in a society where orders descended without question, the sight was unsettling. One day, during a lunch break, a supervisor named Miller asked him about Germany's factories. Karl hesitated, then said quietly that he had worked as an artist, not an engineer. Miller smiled and said, "Same thing. You build with your hands, too." Later that week, Miller requested to keep one of Karl's sketches of the cannery to hang in his office. Karl traded it for a packet of American cigarettes, the first he had tasted in years. He smoked slowly, thinking of Hamburg, of the dark streets where power outages had become routine long before the Allied bombing began. By autumn, his drawings had reached beyond the camp again. A visiting officer from the Office of War Information, reviewing morale materials, saw Karl's work in the chapel and requested permission to reproduce several pieces for an internal publication. The prints appeared under the heading "Hands at Work, Art Behind Wire," accompanied by a short paragraph praising the Geneva Convention. The article was reprinted in small-town newspapers as evidence of American fairness. None of this reached Karl directly until a packet of clippings arrived from the camp's education office with a note thanking him for his contribution to mutual understanding. Among the clippings was a copy of a letter from a church group in Ohio offering to sponsor art supplies for the camp. The gesture confused him. He could not reconcile it with what he had been taught about American cruelty and greed. Yet he also could not deny what he saw: respect given without fear. That winter, while Allied forces fought through Italy and prepared for the invasion of France, Karl painted a large mural for the camp dining hall showing fields under rain, figures at harvest, and a single tree growing in bright sunlight. He titled it "After the Storm." It was not political, not even consciously symbolic, but the prisoners understood. Some said it reminded them of home. Others said it looked like hope. In June 1944, the news of the Normandy landings reached Camp Hearn through the camp newspaper and confirmed the prisoners' growing realization that the war was lost. Reactions varied. Hardline nationalists called it propaganda. Moderates fell silent. Karl listened to the debate but kept working. That month, an American art instructor from the University of Texas visited to inspect the murals and offered to arrange an exhibition in Austin. The proposal was unprecedented. Military regulations forbade the movement of prisoner artwork outside camp without clearance. After weeks of correspondence, approval arrived for a small display at a local library, labeled anonymously as Art by German Prisoners. Karl's pieces drew attention for their realism and restraint. Visitors were struck by their lack of hatred. One critic wrote that the paintings revealed a quiet dignity amid defeat. When the exhibition closed, the officer who had first noticed Karl in the desert forwarded the report to Washington with a remark. "This man uses art the way others use propaganda. Only he builds instead of destroying." The phrase would appear later in a memorandum recommending his early repatriation. Karl knew nothing of it yet. He only knew that his paintings had crossed the wire without him. He wondered what freedom would feel like after living so long inside fences, and whether the talent that had once been forbidden at home might now decide his future. The first months of 1945 unfolded in silence. Winter came late to Texas that year, with frost on the barracks' roofs and thin ice on the camp's water troughs. Inside the wire, life continued by routine. Roll call, work details, classes, and evening gatherings. But beneath the order, there was tension. News from Europe told of German cities in ruins, of bombings that flattened Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden. Karl Weber read the American newspapers pinned to the bulletin board and stared at the photographs of destruction. He could not find the street where his studio had once stood. The Allied armies were pushing across the Rhine, and the Reich he had served without conviction was collapsing under its own weight. Among the prisoners, disbelief gave way to dread. Letters from home, screened by censors, spoke of shortages, evacuations, and the disappearance of relatives. For Karl, the images of shattered buildings and smoking ruins carried a personal ache. He thought of his parents' small apartment on Spaldingstrasse and the sketches he had left behind. Yet amid the despair, his work inside Camp Hearn expanded. The camp's educational director, noting his patience with younger prisoners, asked him to teach drawing classes. Each evening he sat with a group of 20 men in a converted barrack, showing them how to build form from shadow, how to catch motion in a line. They drew each other, the guards, the watchtowers, the long fences stretching into the flatland. He told them that art was not only decoration, it was proof of seeing clearly. Outside the wire, American industry had reached its wartime zenith. By the beginning of 1945, U.S. factories produced more than 80,000 aircraft a year, 50,000 tanks, and 8 million tons of shipping. Railroads ran day and night, carrying the goods that sustained armies across the globe. The power Karl had glimpsed from the train windows in 1943 had grown into a force that dwarfed any nation's imagination. Even as Europe bled, American towns thrived on abundance. New cars waited in storage lots, refrigerators rolled off assembly lines, and electricity illuminated every farmhouse. Within this world of plenty, the prisoners worked quietly, harvesting, repairing, and learning. The Special Projects Division reported that the re-education efforts were producing results. In camp newspapers, articles now discussed democracy, labor rights, and rebuilding. Karl's sketches began to appear beside these essays, often illustrating themes of renewal. One drawing showed a plow cutting through rocky soil under a sunrise. Another depicted a bridge rising over a river, unfinished but steady. They were metaphors. Though he never said so aloud, the Americans encouraged the symbolism. An officer told him that art like his spoke louder than lectures. In March 1945, as Allied troops crossed the Rhine and photographs of liberated concentration camps reached American newspapers, the moral shock reached even into the isolation of Herne. When the camp commandant allowed screened films from Europe to be shown in the recreation hall, the effect on the prisoners was devastating. The newsreels displayed bodies stacked in pits, survivors with hollow faces, and the names of places few had known existed: Buchenwald, Ohrdruf, Bergen-Belsen. Many prisoners turned away. Others shouted that it was lies. Karl sat in the back row and said nothing. He could not speak as he left the hall. That night, he did not draw. Days later, a chaplain visited the camp and spoke quietly of human responsibility and the need for witness. Karl asked to borrow a Bible, not from faith, but from the need to read something unpolitical. In the margins, he began sketching small figures, thin men walking toward light. He no longer felt pride in survival. What grew in him was a desire to understand how an entire nation, including himself, had been carried along. In April, when news of Hitler's death reached Texas, some prisoners refused to believe it. Others cheered in relief. Karl simply laid his pencil down and whispered to himself that it was finished. The end of the war brought new uncertainty. Repatriation began in waves, first for the sick and wounded, then for those considered least politically compromised. American authorities screened each prisoner through interviews designed to assess ideology. When Karl's turn came, he sat before a young officer who asked about his pre-war occupation. Karl said he had been an artist. The officer asked what kind of art. Karl hesitated, then said, "Satire." The word drew a smile. The officer leafed through a folder containing copies of his sketches, the same that had circulated in reports months earlier. "You were critical of the Nazis?" the officer asked. "I was careful," Karl replied. The officer closed the file and said, "That's another word for brave." In June 1945, a notice appeared on the camp board listing names cleared for early return. His was among them. Before leaving, he packed his notebooks, several rolled canvases, and the Bible filled with pencil figures. The commandant shook his hand and said, "You showed us something good in the middle of a war." When Karl boarded the train bound for the port of New York, he looked through the window at the bright lights fading behind the trees. He realized he would miss them. The electric glow that had first stunned him in 1943 had become a symbol of something deeper, a proof that civilization could be powerful without cruelty. The same light would haunt his memories long after the ship carried him back to a ruined Europe. The Atlantic crossing in the summer of 1945 was quieter than the one Karl Weber had taken 2 years earlier. The war was over now, and the seas no longer carried the constant threat of submarines. On the Liberty ship bound for Europe, the prisoners filled the holds with low voices and the rustle of letters written on Red Cross stationery. Karl spent much of the voyage on deck, sketching the horizon, the ship's funnels, and the long, calm trails of smoke that rose into the sky. He felt the hum of the engines under his feet and thought of the unseen factories that had built every part of this vessel. The bolts, the plates, the turbines, assembled by workers he would never meet. He knew that behind this single ship stood a network of labor and material greater than any he had imagined possible. The scale of it remained almost beyond comprehension. Over 2,700 Liberty ships constructed in American yards between 1941 and 1945, each capable of carrying 10,000 tons of cargo across the ocean. For Karl, this was no longer just machinery. It had become a kind of architecture of freedom, proof of what a society could create when its energy was not bound by fear. The same system that had built ships to fight had also built schools, farms, and lights that never went out. As he stood by the railing watching waves break against the hull, he wondered what would greet him in Germany, and whether there would be anything left to rebuild. When the ship docked at Le Havre, Karl saw a coastline scarred by war. The port lay in ruins, cranes twisted and silent, warehouses burned to shells. The contrast with the American docks was overwhelming. From Le Havre, the prisoners were moved by train through France, passing through towns still marked by fighting. Bridges lay in pieces, rails bent and scorched, fields littered with wreckage. Civilians stood by the tracks, staring in silence at the passing trains of returning soldiers. By the time Karl crossed into Germany, the landscape had become a wasteland. Villages were flattened, chimneys rose from piles of stone, and in every station the smell of smoke and hunger lingered. The train stopped near Münster, where the British occupation authorities had established a processing center. The prisoners were deloused, questioned, and issued temporary papers identifying them as repatriated personnel. Karl felt both gratitude and loss. He had been eager to return home, yet the camp in Texas had provided food, order, and purpose. Here there was only scarcity. In Hamburg, when he finally reached what had been his neighborhood, he found the street half erased by bombing. The building that had housed his studio no longer existed. His parents had been evacuated months earlier to the countryside. He wandered through the rubble carrying his pack, unsure of where to begin. Germany in 1945 was a country of ruins and ration cards. The Allied occupation divided the nation into 4 zones, each governed by a different power. Hamburg lay within the British zone, administered from military headquarters in Bad Oeynhausen. The population struggled to survive among shortages of food, fuel, and housing. Millions of displaced persons and returning soldiers crowded into cities already overwhelmed by refugees. Yet amid the devastation, a strange vitality stirred. Relief agencies established soup kitchens, the British authorities reopened schools, and new newspapers appeared under Allied supervision. The denazification process sought to remove party members from public life and identify individuals suitable for rebuilding administration and industry. It was through this system that Karl's name resurfaced. Among the countless files on former prisoners, one carried a note from the American Office of War Information recommending him for employment in educational and cultural reconstruction. In early 1946, a British officer summoned him to an interview. They discussed his work in Camp Hearn, the murals, and the exhibition in Austin. When the officer asked what he believed art could do for a defeated nation, Karl answered simply, "It can make people see each other again." Weeks later, he was assigned to assist in the reorganization of the Hamburg School of Arts and Crafts, which the war had reduced to a handful of teachers working in borrowed rooms. The work began slowly. The building was half collapsed, windows shattered, walls cracked by bombs. Karl and a team of young students swept debris, painted new walls, and scavenged furniture from abandoned offices. Supplies were scarce. Canvases were cut from old sheets, brushes made from horsehair. Yet the spirit inside those ruined rooms was stronger than anything Karl had felt since the war began. The students came hungry but eager, some barely 20 years old, some former soldiers like himself. They wanted to learn something untainted by propaganda. Karl taught them composition, perspective, and the habit of looking closely at ordinary life. The curve of a street, the posture of a worker, the texture of light. The British administration encouraged such efforts, seeing in them a means to rebuild not only structures but minds. By the end of 1946, exhibitions of new German art were being organized under Allied supervision, showing landscapes instead of war, faces instead of slogans. Karl contributed a painting titled "The Bridge at Winter," depicting a group of men rebuilding a damaged span over a frozen river. The painting was later shown in London as part of a cultural exchange titled "Germany's New Artists." For him, it symbolized the fragile connection between past and future. The bridge was incomplete, but it stood. Through these years, Karl's reputation quietly grew. Former prisoners wrote to him from across Germany, recalling the classes in Texas and asking for advice. Some sent their own drawings. In 1947, the Hamburg Art School received a shipment of supplies from the same church in Ohio that had once sent paint to Camp Hearn. With it came a letter addressed to Karl, signed by the family of the American officer who had first noticed his work in Tunisia. They wrote that they remembered his drawings and were glad to know he was alive. In response, Karl sent one of his new paintings as a gift. It showed a field under spring rain, a single tree in bloom. Along the bottom edge he wrote, "From the prisoner who learned freedom." The painting would hang for decades in a small church hall in Ohio, its colors fading but never lost. For Karl, it marked the completion of a journey that had begun in surrender and ended in understanding. He no longer thought of his talent as forbidden. It had saved his life, bridged nations, and taught him that art, in its quiet persistence, could outlast even the ruins of war. The year 1948 found Germany no longer a defeated army, but a wounded nation beginning to move again. Rubble was still piled in the streets, yet new scaffolds rose above the ruins. Across the British and American zones, factories restarted, power lines were repaired, and trains began to run on schedule. Karl Weber, now 32, walked each morning through the rebuilt gates of the Hamburg School of Arts and Crafts, where students arrived carrying sketch pads instead of rifles. The classrooms smelled of turpentine and coal dust, a mixture of hardship and rebirth. Karl's position had changed from assistant to full instructor in design and composition. He taught not only technique, but responsibility. "Every line we draw is a choice, he told his students. We learned where blind obedience leads. His classes filled quickly. Young Germans, many too young to remember the early years of the war, came seeking a way to express something new, something neither nostalgic nor political. Outside the studio, the Allied authorities were reshaping the entire German economy. In June 1948, the Western powers introduced a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, replacing the worthless Reichsmark and igniting the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle that would define the next decade. Industrial output, which had stood at only 35% of pre-war levels in 1946, began to surge. Marshall Plan funds flowed into reconstruction projects, rebuilding power stations, rail networks, and housing. For Karl, these changes appeared first as new faces in his classroom. Engineers, draftsmen, and architects attended night classes to relearn design methods interrupted by the war. They brought stories of machine shops reopening under American contracts, of shipyards along the Elbe welding hulls again. The noise of hammers and saws that once meant war now signaled recovery, yet the moral wounds remained. In faculty meetings, debates flared over what German art should represent. Some older teachers clung to traditional realism, while others urged abstract experimentation as a rejection of the past. Karl stood between them. He argued that art must face reality before it could transcend it. His own paintings from that period show bridges, cranes, and workers, human figures dwarfed by rebuilding but not erased by it. In late 1949, as the Federal Republic of Germany was founded in Bonn, Karl received an invitation from the British Cultural Relations Office to exhibit his post-war work in London. The collection, titled Structures of Renewal, consisted of 15 paintings and drawings depicting reconstruction sites, city markets, and workshops. He traveled by ferry across the same channel his nation had once tried to dominate by force. In London, he saw a city still bearing its own scars, buildings propped by timber, blocks leveled by bombs, but alive with energy. The exhibition opened quietly in a small gallery off Oxford Street. Reviewers noted the sincerity of the work, calling it art without propaganda. One British critic wrote that Karl Weber's canvases show a Germany re-examining itself through honest labor rather than slogans. The show led to new correspondence between British and German art schools, part of a wider cultural exchange sponsored by the occupying authorities to heal relations through shared study. During a visit to a London museum, Karl stood before a painting by J.M.W. Turner and felt for the first time that the distance between nations was smaller than he had believed. The colors of storm and light spoke a language older than war. Returning to Hamburg, Karl found his school thriving. Enrollment had doubled, and the city's galleries were reopening. In the evenings, he worked on a series of large murals commissioned for the new municipal library. The subject was chosen by the city council, the progress of knowledge. Karl painted scenes of students, workers, and scientists surrounded by open books, their faces lit by electric lamps. He used the glow deliberately, remembering the first American nights that had stunned him in 1943. To him, light had come to symbolize civilization itself, the quiet power that neither shouts nor kills. When the murals were unveiled in 1950, crowds filled the library hall. Among the visitors was a delegation from the American consulate, which had supported the restoration project. The cultural attaché recognized Karl's name from wartime reports and introduced himself afterward. "Your work was known to us long ago," he said with a smile. "It was good propaganda in the best sense, proof that people can change." For Karl, the words carried a weight greater than praise. They meant that his drawings, born in captivity, had reached farther than he ever intended. As the lights in the library burned late into the evening, he stood before his own mural and realized that the story of his forbidden talent had come full circle. The pencil that had once been an act of defiance had become a bridge between enemies, drawn not in secret but in light. The winter of 1951 was harsh across northern Germany, but inside the rebuilt library of Hamburg, the lamps under Karl Weber's murals burned warmly. The city had changed beyond recognition since his return 6 years earlier. Electric trams rattled once more through the streets, barges moved along the Elbe, and markets overflowed with food from the countryside. Factories that had been shells in 1945 were now producing steel, ships, and machine tools at levels that astonished visiting economists. The Marshall Plan had injected billions of dollars into Western Europe, and in Germany, those funds had become roads, bridges, and schools. To Karl, the revival was more than economic. It was moral. In every lecture he gave, he reminded his students that creation was the true measure of strength. His reputation grew quietly but steadily, and by the time he was invited to lecture at the New Academy of Fine Arts in Berlin in 1952, his story had begun to circulate. Journalists who heard about the German painter who learned freedom in Texas came to interview him. He spoke softly, choosing words with care, describing captivity not as punishment, but as awakening. "I was fed, I was taught, and I was allowed to draw," he said. "Those three things built me again." The interviews spread beyond Germany. American newspapers, still chronicling the successes of the Marshall Plan, discovered his story and printed features about his transformation. Headlines in small-town papers called him the artist the war couldn't break. Photographs showed him standing before his murals, gray-haired now, holding a brush instead of a weapon. Letters arrived from the United States, some from families who had hosted German prisoners on their farms, others from veterans who remembered the camps. One letter came from the family of the American lieutenant who had first seen his sketches in Tunisia. They wrote that they still kept one of his early drawings and invited him to visit. In 1953, sponsored by the German-American Cultural Exchange Program, Karl sailed again across the Atlantic, this time as a guest, not a prisoner. His return to America was filled with quiet wonder. He landed in New York and traveled south by train, tracing in reverse the route he had taken 10 years before. The stations, the lights, the voices of conductors calling stops, all felt familiar, yet free of the weight of fear. When he reached Texas, he visited Camp Hearn, now empty and overgrown. The barracks were gone, the fences dismantled, but the ground still held traces of paths and foundations. Local residents recognized his name from the newspapers and welcomed him as a friend. The town's historical society arranged a small gathering in the community hall, where he showed slides of his post-war work and spoke about the power of art to rebuild understanding. Among the audience were a few elderly farmers who remembered the German crews who had harvested their cotton in 1944. One woman told him that her husband had once kept a sketch he made of their tractor and that it still hung in their house. Standing before them, Karl felt the full arc of his journey, from surrender to dignity, from captivity to freedom. In the final years of his life, Karl continued to paint and teach. His later works abandoned the ruins entirely and turned to light, fields at dawn, rivers reflecting sky, workers at rest. Critics described his style as documentary realism tempered by faith. He never joined political groups or movements. His legacy grew not through fame but through the students he trained, many of whom carried his lessons into the modern art and design schools of the new Federal Republic. When he died in 1960 at the age of 44, the Hamburger Abendblatt published a brief obituary calling him a man who painted reconciliation. The American embassy sent a wreath with a ribbon that read, "From those who once held him captive," in Hamburg's library beneath the mural. The progress of knowledge, a small plaque was later added. He was captured by war but freed by creation. The story of Karl Weber became one among thousands of quiet transformations that defined post-war Europe. He had begun as a soldier shaped by propaganda and ended as a teacher who believed that the greatest victory of any nation was to inspire its former enemies. His forbidden talent, once a secret act of defiance in the shadow of tyranny, had become a bridge between cultures. In every line he drew, from the desert to the library wall, he carried a single conviction that he had learned through the strange grace of captivity, that true power lies not in conquest, but in the capacity to build, to forgive, and to see clearly.